Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Philosophy of the Paranormal with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Today is the first of our special topics lectures, and we'll be talking about astrology and horoscopes today. So let's get into it. This will be an interesting lecture. It was interesting to put together, certainly, and I think it'll be kind of fun discussing it in this class because it's kind of within my wheelhouse. When I was an undergraduate, I took an astronomy course, and it was actually my best grade until my fourth year, until I received a grade that was higher by 1 percentage point in one of my philosophy classes. So that was fun. I enjoyed this class very much. It was taught by a very interesting character who reminded me a little bit of Professor Frink from The Simpsons, who had a PhD in mathematics from MIT and who worked as a consultant primarily, but who taught this astronomy class in his spare time. And it was a fantastic class. And a lot of what I'm talking about today, I've actually picked up from that class. So that'll be interesting. It was certainly interesting reviewing my old undergraduate astronomy notes for this one. So why am I talking about astronomy here? Well, of course, for many, many centuries, astrology and astronomy were the same field. Astronomy diverged from astrology about the time of the scientific revolution in Europe. But I will talk about that in further detail as we go. I better give you a picture of the plan for today, actually, before I carry on with my ramblings about the history of astronomy. So today's lecture will probably be a little bit shorter than usual, and that's because most of the time allotted for this lecture is actually the time that you are going to take, not just to watch this video, but to watch another episode of Cosmos by Carl Sagan, Andrew Yan, and Stephen Soter. You'll be watching episode 3, by the way, which is called Harmony of the Worlds, and I'll talk a little bit more about what is in that episode in a moment. But before that, or if you have already watched it, I made the link to the video available on See You Learn before I uploaded this lecture. So if you've already watched it, fine. But if you haven't watched it yet, I'm going to provide some background to help fill in some of the details that Sagan glosses over about astrology. So I'll say a little more about how astrology and astronomy differ, why they departed, why astronomy is a flourishing science, and why astrology is regarded as a pseudoscience. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our terms here. So astronomy, first of all, has two root words out of which we've built that term. Astra, which means star, and nomos, which means order. So what do astronomers nowadays study? Well, they study stars, planets, nebulae, galaxies. There's all kinds of different branches of astronomy, right? There are planetary astronomers. There are astronomers that study particular types of stars. There are astronomers that study galaxies. Now, as I mentioned, astronomy really emerged as a proper science in Europe during the scientific revolution. This was thanks to figures like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, Tycho Brahe. Some of these figures we'll be talking about today. This is about the time where astronomy and astrology started to diverge in Europe, as Sagan will talk about in this particular episode of Cosmos. Now, it's not as if these European astronomers were the first people to do astronomy and to call it a science. Not by a long shot. In fact, the Greeks and the Romans had their fair bit of astronomical knowledge as well, but that was actually lost after the fall of Rome during the Dark Ages, particularly in the Western Roman Empire. In the Eastern Roman Empire, some of these ideas carried on and made their way into the Islamic world, where thinkers like Aristotle, for example, were translated into Arabic and read widely. So while Europe was in the Dark Ages, it was actually somewhat of a scientific golden age in the Islamic world. And all kinds of interesting astronomical tools were developed there, like sextants and astrolabes, and these were used for understanding the motions of the stars and planets, because keeping time and navigating depended on being able to do this. And in fact, this is why the Greeks and Romans had earlier developed very similar knowledge of the stars and planets and their motions through the sky over the course of a year. Now, as Carl Sagan is going to mention in this documentary, all ancient human societies had some astronomical knowledge. They had to, because that was how you reckoned time over long periods, more than days and weeks, but months and years. You needed to know about the motions of the sun and the moon and the planets to keep track of the year. Our calendars, to this day, are based on the motions of the sun and the moon and the earth. If you're from a Western background, you're of course familiar with the calendar we use now, the Gregorian calendar, which was based on the earlier Julian calendar, which the Romans used. But if you come from, for example, a Jewish or an Islamic background, you'll be familiar with a lunar calendar. And that's why certain holidays in Judaism and Islam kind of move around the year, because it's a different kind of way to keep time. And of course, these ancient societies from Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, all around the world, had some kind of astronomical knowledge such that they could keep track of the passing of the weeks and the months and the years. Some of these are left behind. Sagan talks about sort of these Stone Age spirals and these stellar calendars that were made by the Anasazi people in the what is now the United States, in the southwestern United States. Of course, other examples that you're probably familiar with are like the Mayans, the Mayan calendar. They were able to reckon very accurately vast stretches of time because they were such careful observers of the motions of the stars and the planets and everything like that. So I guess to sum up astronomy, the word means something like the order of the stars, right? And astronomers study all kinds of celestial phenomena, planets, different kinds of stars, galaxies, black holes, nebula. And if you're not familiar technically what all of these are, just let me know in the comments section, okay? We usually think of astronomy as getting going as a proper science in the scientific revolution at the end of the Dark Ages. But astronomy before that was practiced in the Middle East, and before that in, of course, Greece and Rome and India, Persia, also Africa, and of course in China. Every ancient civilization had some form of astronomy. Now, what about astrology? Well, for a long time, astronomy and astrology were one and the same. There was no difference between the two of them. Astrologers and astronomers did the same things. They studied the stars, and they tried to understand how the motions of the stars and planets would affect our lives here on Earth. So astrology, the root of that word is astra, again, star, and logos, which comes from the Greek meaning logic or reason or true speech, or in the case of scientific nomenclature, the study of. So astrology really means the study of the stars. Perhaps astronomy should really be called astrology, and astrology really astronomy. But this is the way the terminology has been left to us. Now, the roots of astrology actually go back to the same calendrical systems that were developed by ancient societies in the Middle East, in Europe, and in China, in Africa, and North America. Or North and South America, sorry. Of course, and this is a theme that very much is apparent in Sagan's discussion in this documentary, but astronomers and astrologers were both interested, well, because they were the same people, in how the stars and planets and their motions and their relations to one another affected our lives on Earth. Of course, there were very real ways in which where the sun and the moon were affected our lives in terms of how they indicated the seasons, right? We had to know when to plant crops. We had to know when to migrate. We had to know when certain things were in season and when they weren't. Again, Sagan covers all of this very nicely in this documentary, but these are a way that the motions of the stars and planets affected our lives. And also, eventually, astrologers became interested in trying to understand whether the stars and planets and their relations to one another could affect our lives in other ways, perhaps our fates or our destinies or our characters. Presently, astronomy is a flourishing science. It is one of the coolest sciences out there. I mean, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be an astronomer. Now, of course, I study the cosmos within, not the cosmos without, but I still love nerding out over Carl Sagan, as you are no doubt able to tell. Astrology, on the other hand, is considered by mainstream astronomers to be a pseudoscience. That is, it looks superficially a bit like a science, but it doesn't explain things scientifically. It doesn't posit theories or hypotheses that can be tested. It does not posit laws that describe how these relations in nature work. And it kind of appeals to this idea that it kind of appeals to a non-physicalist or non-naturalist idea, especially in its ancient forms where the stars and planets and constellations were thought to be gods. Nowadays, it's a bit less straightforward, but it's still often talked about as the stars and constellations and these celestial bodies in astrology are kind of like astrological forces that have, that have these effects on our lives. So what astronomers do is they try to study celestial objects naturalistically, but what astrologers do is try to divine information from a person's life, whether that be about how their life is going to unfold, their character, their personality. They try to divine this information from the motions and positions of celestial objects at the moment of these people's births. So today, I want to make a note that I'm focusing primarily on Western astrology, and Western astrology originated with the societies that lived in Mesopotamia. That is the fertile stretch of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Middle East. From here, it spread from, Persia, Babylon, and those places. It spread to Greece and Rome into Europe, and then back during the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It kind of got picked up and reinvigorated and further developed in the Arabic world. From there, eventually, these texts made it back to Europe. They were translated from Arabic back into Greek and Latin, and Western Europe began its own scientific revolution, picking up from the golden age of Islam, where they kind of had their own scientific revolution earlier. Now, I mention all of this because there are, of course, other old astrological systems as well. Oh, bye! For example, some of the oldest astrological systems that we know of today can be found in India and China, because those are two very old civilizations. So the astrological systems we find in India and China are old as well, but they're also a little bit different from those that we find in Western astrology. Of course, there are African astrological traditions. There were further developments in Asian astrological traditions. I'm talking about like Polynesian navigators who were very sophisticated in terms of their astronomical knowledge, in terms of their ability to navigate, explore the Pacific Ocean, and reach Polynesian islands all the way to Hawaii, and perhaps even to the west coast of South America, although we're not sure about that. So there's lots of astrological systems out there, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on Western astrology and how it diverged from astronomy and became astrology as we know it today, as a kind of pseudoscience. Why do I say it's a pseudoscience? Well, other than the reasons I mentioned earlier, where it does not posit naturalistic mechanisms to explain naturalistic phenomena that we can test with observation and experimentation and so forth, Western astrology is really a kind of divination. What is divination? Well, divination is a way of gathering information, or a way of attempting to gather information, I should say, from a supernatural or a divine source. So Ouija boards, dowsing, tarot cards, these are also forms of divination. Palm reading, reading tea leaves, right? Or reading the entrails of animals is another one that's practiced somewhere.
This is something that's practiced somewhere.
Yes.
I don't know.
Someone's looking at guts. I might leave this in. So anyway, these are all forms of divination, trying to get information from a divine or a supernatural source. But you may be wondering, what are you talking about? If I read my horoscope in the newspaper, for example, well, it's just telling me some information based on my astrological sign. That's not supernatural or divine. Well, they used to be. So, for example, the planets, what we call the planets nowadays, these celestial bodies that orbit suns that don't shine by their own light, comes from this word planetos. That's a Greek word, planetos, that means wanderers. They used to be considered gods. In fact, they're named wanderers, or called wanderers, because of this retrograde motion they exhibit, which you'll learn about when you watch the Carl Sagan documentary. In any case, planets used to be considered gods. That is why our planets in our solar system have Roman names, Roman god names. Jupiter, the largest of the planets, is named after the patriarch of the Roman pantheon. Saturn, the god of time. Venus, the goddess of love, right? So all of the planets are actually named after Roman gods in our solar system. So the moons have Greek names, by the way. So the Jovian moons, the moons of Jupiter, right? Like Io and Ganymede and Callisto, they have Greek names. An interesting fact, most of the stars that we can see with the naked eye, probably around 2/3 of them, have Arabic names because of the astronomical knowledge that the West inherited from the Islamic scientists who were working in the Arabic world prior to the scientific revolution in Europe. Tula doesn't know astronomy.
Professor Tula, what's today's lesson?
You know, this idea of celestial bodies being divine is even preserved in the names of gods in, old pantheons like Jupiter and Zeus, for example. All of these words are cognate with a Proto-Indo-European word, which has been reconstructed and which sounds something like Deus Vater, which means sky father. And this is an Indo-European root word that's been reconstructed. And Indo-European is an ancestor language that was probably spoken 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and it's the ancestor language to the Germanic and Romance languages in Europe. It's the ancestor language to Iranian or Farsi and those languages, and it's also an ancestor language to Sanskrit and eventually Hindu in India. So that's why we call it Proto-Indo-European. These speakers probably lived and spoke this language around the Caucasus 5,000 years ago and spread out into India and into Europe. So they have this god, Deus Vater, Sky Father, which is cognate with Jupiter in Latin. It's cognate with Zeus or Zeus in Greek. It's cognate with Tyr in the Old Norse language and religion. It's also cognate with the Vedic Sanskrit Dyaspita. So this idea of gods in the sky is quite old and is often contrasted with the idea of an Earth Mother, right? So Sky Father, Earth Mother. Although in ancient Egypt, it's actually backwards. They had a Sky Mother and an Earth Father. So why do I mention all of this about divine beings in the sky and their influence on our lives? Well, I'm hoping to draw your attention to something that Freud and Jentsch talked about, which we covered much earlier in the course. And that is, of course, the early human animistic view of the universe. To paraphrase Jentsch, to view the world as alive and alive in a similar way to the way that we're alive. That's animism. And that's going on here. Finding beings in the sky, right? That's animism. And perhaps these beings influence our lives. So if we understand how these beings move about the sky and what they do, maybe we can understand our lives as well. And that is the fundamental idea that kind of motivated astrology as a study of how celestial events affect human events and human lives. Now, a lot of people do believe in astrology, right? But do they know how astrology is supposed to work? I often wonder this, and that is why I'm going to take some time now to explain the basic idea behind modern Western astrology. I don't believe this works, by the way. If you cannot already tell, I am a skeptic about astrology. But astrologers use some of the same tools that astronomers use, particularly when it comes to reckoning time and navigating, as I mentioned earlier. So there's a few things we're going to have to cover here that Sagan doesn't cover in Harmony of the Worlds in the 3rd episode of Cosmos. So one thing to know is all about the celestial sphere. I'll put a celestial sphere up here somewhere so you can see. But basically, the celestial sphere is used by astronomers and navigators and astronomers. And it's kind of like I've made a mistake in my slides. It's not a 3D map of the entire sky. It's a 2D map. Well, it's 2D and 3D, really. The celestial sphere, if you want to picture it, is like a giant sphere that's arbitrarily large around the Earth. And we map all of the stars that we can see onto it, 3-dimensionally. But when we look up, it's like a 2-dimensional plane that's kind of wrapped around us as a globe. So the Earth is like within another globe, and that larger globe is a map of the stars from how they would look here on Earth. So as the Earth revolves on its axis, the Earth has this axis, it's tilted about 23 degrees, and it revolves, right? This is why we have day and night. So as the Earth is turning, stars appear to rotate around the celestial poles, which you can see here. The north celestial pole, by the way, is very easy to find. You can go out into the night sky. You can even see it here in the city. Go out into the night sky. You want to look in the northern sky about 45, 46 degrees above the horizon, and you will find Polaris, the North Star, which is approximately at the north celestial pole. And if you were to take a long exposure photograph of this night sky, you would see that all the other stars appear to orbit around this pole as the Earth turns on its axis. So it's important to know about the celestial sphere, because the celestial sphere is how we map out all of the constellations. So I'll get to that in a moment. Before we talk about constellations, though, we need to talk about a couple of other particulars of the celestial sphere. I've already mentioned the celestial poles, but a few other things you need to know about are the ecliptic plane and the celestial equator. Now, the apparent path of the sun through the year, from our perspective on Earth, actually traces a path around the celestial sphere. Okay? So, if you were to map this path, say the position on the horizon where the sun rises and where the stars are relative to that, you would be able to trace a path around the celestial sphere. And that is called the ecliptic. And you can see it here in this picture. The ecliptic is not to be confused with the celestial equator. The celestial equator is kind of like the halfway, a hemispheric division around the celestial sphere, but it's not flat. It's 90 degrees relative to the celestial pole, which is, of course, tilted 23.4 degrees. So it's not straight up, it's tilted a little bit. Now, the sun actually does cross the celestial equator at a couple of points, at the vernal and autumnal equinox, the days of the year which are, kind of halfway between the solstices. So yes, the apparent motion of the sun around the celestial sphere and the path that it takes is called the ecliptic. And that's important to know if you want to understand where we get our astrological signs from. Speaking of signs, you hear about these, the zodiac signs, right? Why are there 12 of them? Where do we get them from? Well, the zodiac signs come from constellations in the zodiac, which is the group of constellations around the ecliptic. So the zodiac comprises all of these 12 constellations that the sun passes through in the ecliptic plane. Now, what are constellations? Well, constellations are groups of stars as we see them from Earth. Think of the Big Dipper, for example, right? It looks like a dipper or a saucepan or something. And we see those groups of stars and we say, that one's the Big Dipper, this one's the Little Dipper, here's Cassiopeia, here's Orion. You've probably heard of these constellations. But constellations aren't just groups of stars. They're also like areas of the celestial sphere. If you think of the celestial sphere as kind of like a globe, then constellations are a bit like countries or land masses or oceans that we label on the globe, right? They're different areas of the globe sphere. Constellations are different areas of the celestial sphere. So they're groups of stars, but they're also like parts of a map. And you can see here, depending on where Earth is around the sun, we're going to see the sun rise in a different constellation. We're going to see different constellations during the night sky. And this is where we get the zodiac signs from, the constellations of the zodiac. Of course, the zodiac signs are all given right here. So these are what our zodiac signs are. They're signs that stand in for these constellations along the ecliptic. And the sun rises in a different one about every month. Now, what do astrologers do with this information? Well, astronomers would use this for navigation or for mapping the night sky. But astrologers would use this to divine information about you. They would do this by constructing what's called a horoscope. Now, you've probably heard of a horoscope. Maybe you've read your horoscope in a newspaper recently, although it's more likely that if you read horoscopes, you probably read it on the internet, or perhaps you have an app for horoscopes. Now, these horoscopes are typically something like, well, hang on, let me find an example. All right, so I found my horoscope. I was born in September, so I'm a Virgo. And let's see what astrology.com says about my horoscope. August 15th horoscope for Virgo. An opportunity for a trip or some other sort of geographical change could be coming your way soon. Cool. If you already have a trip planned, you can expect it to go incredibly well. A big payoff is due today on the financial front as well, and it's one you should share with the people you love. Think of everything they've done for you in recent months. Return the favor in any way you can. So that's an example of the kind of horoscope you're probably familiar with. It gives you your sign and gives you some advice or something, right? But proper horoscopes are really like star charts. And what they do is they use information, based on the time and place of your birth, and they construct a star chart. Where were the constellations? Where was the sun and the moon rising? Where were all of the planets? What were their angles relative to one another? All of this information would be contained in a proper horoscope. Now, the positions of these bodies and all of their angles relative to one another is supposed to reveal information about your life. It's supposed to have an impact on your life. And this is why, people look for their particular sign when they read a horoscope. But really, those horoscopes are kind of like one-size-fits-all horoscope. A professional astrologer would probably want to do a detailed horoscope from you. Although, as I'm about to discuss in a moment, whether this horoscope would actually reveal any information about you or your life is questionable. So, does astrology actually work? Does it actually reveal anything about your life, your character, your future, etc.? I'm sorry to tell you that the answer is probably no. There are many reasons why we should be suspect of the claims of astrology, and I'm just going to give you a couple here for your consideration. Now, earlier you may recall in my discussion of the celestial sphere and the ecliptic that the Earth rotates on its axis, and that axis is kind of like off. It's kind of like on a slant of around 23 degrees. But it doesn't stay this way. Over many, many, many centuries, the Earth actually wobbles a little bit like a top, right? So in, 12,000 years or whatever, Polaris won't be the North Star anymore, right? Now, because of this change over the centuries in the Earth's axis tilt, the zodiac that's used by astrologers is actually off by one whole sign. For example, back in the day, 2,000 years ago, I would have been a Virgo. Yes, that's true. But now, because of the changes in the Earth's orbit, I'm actually a Libra. But astrologers don't pay attention to this sort of thing. They're still using the zodiac as it was used many, many, many years ago. Not the zodiac of today. So really, am I a Libra? Well, let's check my Libra horoscope from astrology.com. If someone confuses you today, just avoid them, no matter how attractive you may find them. It says if someone confuses you today, just avoid them, no matter how attractive you may find them.
Are you confusing? Am I confusing you today?
I'm sorry, dear. People who send mixed messages, play head games, and just aren't clear about who they are in general have nothing of any real value. Oh, a pop-up ad for a tarot reading. Excuse me. Have nothing of any real value to add to your life. Like a bad cold, they'll bring you nothing but restless nights and overwhelming fatigue. Right now, you should stick to known territory and the people that you know that you can always count on. Well, good advice, but who's it for? Is it for Libras or Virgos? And who is a Libra and who is a Virgo anyway? Where is the Earth right now in its wobbly motions over the vast stretches of time? Anyway, don't take my word for it. I'm going to share a little video clip from Bill Nye the Science Guy from his program, The Eyes of Nye. And he talks about this change in the Earth's axis tilt over time and why the zodiac used by astrologers is off for that reason. Something that Sagan is going to talk about in Cosmos is this interesting phenomenon where we have twins that are separated at birth. Now, twins that are separated at birth are used in twin studies for all kinds of things. Sometimes to explore this nature-nurture debate, right? Is it genetics or environment that affects people's lives? We'll use twins that were separated at birth and perhaps adopted out to different families to look at things like this. But we can also see if astrology is true by doing this. We could have twins who were born in the same place at the same time. So they would have just about identical horoscopes. But there might be a case where one twin dies early and horribly and the other lives to a ripe, old, prosperous age. How could we explain this if astrology is true and if their horoscopes are virtually identical? And of course, the constellations of the zodiac only look the way they do from our vantage point on Earth, right? If you were to travel far into deep space, hundreds of light years away from the planet Earth and look at those same constellations, they would look completely different because we're only seeing them two-dimensionally, but of course they exist in three dimensions. So if we viewed them from a different angle or from a different distance, we wouldn't recognize them. And of course, stars too move. So constellations today, even from Earth, don't look like they did thousands of years ago. And they don't look like, in millions of years in the future, they won't look like they do now. Of course, stars also go through their own life cycles. They condense and accrete from nebulas and gas and dust, and they shine. They go through stages in their lives, and eventually they die. Perhaps they turn into a red giant, and maybe they go supernova, right? Maybe you've heard recently about this star Betelgeuse, or Betelgeuse, or no one knows how to say this word, really. Anyway, I'm just going to say Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is a red supergiant in the constellation Orion, and Betelgeuse is nearing the end of its life cycle. It'll probably go supernova. Maybe it'll happen in our lifetimes. Maybe it'll happen thousands of years from now. We don't know. But one day, relatively soon in the grand scheme of things, Betelgeuse will explode. It will go supernova and create a massive explosion that'll outshine all the stars in the sky, and it'll spread gas and dust and heavy metals and minerals throughout the universe. And maybe millions of years in the future, another star will form out of that debris, perhaps with planets like our solar system. So stars are born, they live, and they die. They don't stay the same. It just looks like everything up there stays the same, because everything up there is so big and far away and happens over such vast timescales. And we're so small and tiny, stuck to the planet, and we live such brief lives. Anyway, don't take my word for this. I'm not an astronomer. I'll share another clip of Carl Sagan explaining the constellations below. This is from a different episode of Cosmos, but it's important to keep in mind for watching this particular episode, The Harmony of the Worlds. Alright, so we've covered some astronomical reasons why astrology probably doesn't work, but there are probably some psychological elements at play too that lend to the idea of the convincingness of astrology. So I'll share this link to a quick experiment that was done by James Randi with a group of college students. And what he did was he passed out these horoscopes to everyone. And all of these people were told that their horoscope had been constructed just for them, based on their location of birth, and the date, so on and so forth. They had to rate the accuracy of their horoscopes from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most accurate and 1 being the least accurate. And many of these folks thought that their horoscopes were pretty accurate, until they were asked to share their horoscopes with everyone else in the class. And it was soon realized that everyone had gotten the same horoscope, and everyone thought that their horoscope revealed some accurate information about themselves, even though they all had different astrological signs. So, what's going on here? Perhaps a little bit of confirmation bias is at play. You remember confirmation bias. I talked about it briefly in a previous video. I characterized it as remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. But what confirmation bias really is a cognitive bias that we all have. Believers in pseudoscience and skeptics and scientists alike can suffer from the confirmation bias. And by the way, there's a broader debate in the cognitive sciences about whether cognitive biases and heuristics, which are like mental shortcuts for thinking, stereotypes and the like, about whether these make us better or poorer at thinking. Like Gerd Gigerenzer, for example, thinks that heuristics are fast and frugal and make us smart, whereas Tversky and Kahneman think that heuristics can lead us to make mistakes. And very much the same thing could be said about cognitive biases. They're designed to help us save cognitive resources, right? We want to save our cognition for new situations so that we can figure things out. It's better to be more or less on automatic pilot for other things to save those resources. So, thus we have cognitive biases. Now, in the confirmation bias, that's a bias to more easily remember or more easily attend to information that supports our worldview. So perhaps in the case of astrology, people are attending to information that they feel tells them about themselves, and that's salient to them, but they kind of ignore or forget the stuff that's not accurate or that's vague. And this may suggest not only that the horoscope was accurate, but that astrology is also a valid means of divining information about things. Of course, if I take a look at my horoscope here, it says that people who send mixed messages, play head games, and just aren't clear about who they are in general have nothing of any real value to add to your life. I mean, that sounds like something that could apply to anyone, right? Regardless of your sign. But maybe you're a Libra and you think, oh, that's particularly relevant to my life now, so astrology seems to be accurate. But really, it's vague and could apply to anybody, regardless of their sign. Indeed, I don't know if I'm a Libra or a Virgo. Are we using the ancient Babylonian zodiac, or are we using the modern zodiac? Now, of course, there are probably other psychological or cognitive factors at play aside from the confirmation bias. We've seen time and again that people who believe in one kind of esoteric or paranormal belief tend to believe in other similar ideas, right? So if you believe in ESP, you probably also believe in astrology or UFOs, for example. We've seen this a number of times. We've also seen that people who believe in things like the paranormal or in astrology tend to have less objective knowledge about how these things are actually supposed to work or about how these practices came to be. So many people who believe in astrology don't actually know the particulars of the ecliptic and the celestial sphere and the zodiac and the motions of everything and what horoscopes actually are. Perhaps now that you've learned a little bit about what this stuff actually is, maybe you're a little bit more skeptical of astrology. Who knows? In any case, there are obviously many psychological factors at play here, and we don't have time to dive into them in great detail, but I wanted you to be aware that there are, reasons in here as well as reasons out there why astrology probably doesn't work. All right, so I've covered a lot of the background, the nuts and bolts about astrology that Sagan kind of glosses over in his documentary. So, you'll have the tools you need to understand what he says about astrology in this particular episode of Cosmos. And again, if you've already watched if you've seen it before watching this lecture, that's fine. But I've done this lecture toward the end of preparing you to watch this episode of Cosmos. So what does Sagan do here? Well, he gives a brief account of astrology, and he talks about ancient people's reliance on understanding the motions of celestial bodies, for calendars, for navigation, and so on. And he then moves on, and this is the meat and potatoes of the episode, to discuss the life of Johannes Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion. These are the laws of nature that tell us how planets move around stars. And not only that, but how moons move around planets, how stars move around the centers of galaxies, how artificial satellites move around Earth. Basically, he gave us the building blocks of rocket science, if you think about it. Now, one thing I want you to pay particular attention to as you're watching this is that Sagan is not simply debunking. Remember last time when I talked about anomalistic psychology, how just debunking or being antagonistic is not a good approach to take in order to educate people on science and pseudoscience and why paranormal and supernatural stuff probably isn't true. You can't just say, it's all wrong, it's all BS. You're not going to win anyone over to your side that way. And Sagan doesn't just debunk. He actually spends rather little time talking about astrology, and he spends more time telling the story of Kepler and how he was an ardent believer in astrology, as well as ancient Greek ideas like the harmony of the worlds and the Pythagorean solids. Old esoteric ideas that we don't have to get into today, but ideas that were very popular in Pythagoras and among he and his cult members in ancient Greece. Kepler, of course, had to abandon a lot of these ideas in the face of evidence. At the time, the heliocentric model of the solar system had just been reintroduced by Copernicus, and it explained the motions of the planets in terms of circular orbits around the sun. Circles are perfect. Kepler wanted those orbits to be circular. But as you'll find out when you watch the documentary, planets actually move around suns in ellipses, and Kepler had to dispense with a lot of his old beliefs to discover this truth. So it's quite an inspiring story, the way Sagan tells it. And of course, Kepler, along with his colleague Tycho Brahe, and with other contemporaries like Galileo of Galilee, worked out how the planets actually moved, and that they were not perfect Pythagorean shapes. They weren't crystal spheres. They weren't gods. They were bodies that moved around stars according to laws of nature. And the people who discovered this were the same people that had to shake off their old incorrect beliefs in astrology in order to find these things out. How inspiring is that? It just, boy, I get excited when I think of stories from the history of science like this. So as you watch this documentary, what I want you to do is reflect on a few things. If you do believe in astrology, then maybe think about whether your knowledge of how astrology works has changed. If you feel like you know more about astrology now, have your beliefs in it changed at all? Do you believe it more or less? I would expect you might be a little bit more skeptical of astrology now, but perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps you think I'm just wrong and you still believe in astrology. That's fine, although I urge you to reconsider. If you disbelieve in astrology, did you get there just by thinking it was silly and stupid and just debunking? Or do you now feel, now that you understand it more, maybe a little more sympathetic to the people that believe in it? Maybe they are incorrect, but, it's an earnest attempt at gaining knowledge, perhaps. And of course, no matter what you believe, have you noticed the early connections I drew between, our view of an animistic universe and the projects of astrology? I think those connections are pretty salient. But if you have questions about this, or if you want to discuss it further, definitely let me know in the comments section. Notice once again, we're dealing with naturalistic, materialistic, physicalist, scientific explanations versus non-physical, non-naturalistic explanations. That is, astronomy versus astrology. And it's not clear how astrology would work if the stars and planets are not really gods, if they're not even influencing us somehow. How could it work? Sagan mentions in the documentary that the only conceivable way that he could think of the planets as having an influence on us is through their gravity. But the gravitational influence of the people and objects around us on the planet Earth is actually stronger than the influence of the planets. Yes, the planets are very, very massive, but everything else is a lot closer to us. And because of the inverse square law, which, again, if you have questions about that, let me know. I'll explain the inverse square law in the comment section. The influence of these strong gravitational forces is minuscule because the strength of these forces decreases exponentially, proportional to the square of the distance between us and the gravitational body. Anyway, now some people here make very strange claims, like perhaps there are beings in the stars, aliens perhaps. You hear this a lot about the constellation of the Pleiades. There are ancient, wise civilizations that come from the Pleiades which could influence our lives on Earth. But the Pleiades are actually very young stars. There has not been time for planets to form around them and for life to form on those planets and for that life to become intelligent. So I think this is quite unlikely as well. There may be alien life out there, but I don't think it's influencing us in a way that could be picked out by the methods of astrology. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. If you've already watched the episode of Cosmos, Harmony of the Worlds, then I hope that this lecture will clarify a few things for you. And if you haven't watched it yet, I hope that this lecture, likewise, prepares you for assessing the material that Sagan is going to talk about. And either way, I hope you find this interesting. Again, I'm not trying to convince you of one side or another. Well, I am trying to change your beliefs, I suppose, but I'm trying to do it in an ethical way, right? I want to give you the facts, just the facts, and I'd like you to use your critical thinking to try and see why astrology is probably not accurate, why it doesn't really do anything. Oh yes, that's it for today. That is the first of our special topics lectures, and this was a fun one to talk about. I had a lot of fun making this one, and I had a lot of fun doing the research for this one too, because I got to look up all this old astronomy knowledge that I hadn't really thought about in a very long time. Not since my undergraduate days in my astronomy class, anyway. So we've got two special topics left. We've got Canadian cryptozoology, and we've got deja vu / the sixth sense. I'll keep the next one a surprise. I don't know which one I'm going to lecture on yet, actually, but it probably won't require any readings, and it will probably be shorter as these kinds of lectures are. It'll probably be a little shorter. You know, just something fun to reflect on and to use the tools we've gathered and the tools we've used for ourselves throughout this course to apply them to new problems that we haven't talked about yet. So that's all. I hope you enjoy Cosmos, or that you have enjoyed it if you've already watched it. And if you have any questions about anything I've said today, let me know in the comment section, on Discord, via email, or on See You Learn. Otherwise, I hope you take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.